Hey everybody, and welcome to Chapter 2. We are going to be talking a lot about the eye from here until Chapter 8. So buckle in, we're going to be talking a lot about vision. And in particular, in this video, we're going to be focusing, in this chapter, we're going to be focusing on the anatomy of the eye and the structure that the eye has and what that means about how we perceive the world. So, so I'm going to try to break this out into 3 different videos, where the first video we're going to be talking a little bit about light and talking a little bit about some of the basic structures of the eye. The second video is going to be a little bit more about the retina and photoreception, and the third video is going to be about the receptive fields, which is going to bleed into our Chapter 3 content as well. So let's just get right into it. The videos that I have for this particular chapter are mostly about some of the neuroscience techniques that we talked about last chapter. So one of the most interesting ones was transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a technology not everybody knows exists, right? Usually when I talk about this in class, people are fascinated because they've never heard of it before, even though it has been around 10-15 years in mass markets. So you can check out some of the ways that it works in these videos right here. I'm not going to be asking you anything specific about these particular videos on an exam. They're just kind of to help you understand and visualize how these things work. And speaking of visualizing things, let's talk about light. Do you like that transition? Do you like how I did that? So let's talk a little about light. Normally when we talk about light, we're actually talking about a very, very, very specific kind of light. We're mostly talking about the light that we can see, which is very, very narrow in the grand scheme of things. We're talking about moving from red hues over to blue hues, which is, all things considered, not representative of what most of light is. For example, television waves are a form of light. We don't see television waves though, right? We don't see radio waves, we don't see microwaves or heat waves or ultraviolet waves or X-ray waves or gamma rays. Unless you're the Hulk or Bruce Banner, you can do that. But for the most part, we see just this very narrow slice of reality, basically. Our eye only is able to interpret these particular frequencies. If you get a little bit, we'll talk more about this in the color chapter, but what you're looking at right here with the red is about as fast as these frequencies get for our eye to really be able to pick up on. Anything faster than that, faster frequency, becomes infrared, and we can't actually see that stuff. Some animals can. Some animals like crows, for example, a lot of avian species can see infrared. But if we start slowing that frequency down, it'll start appearing to us as orange and yellow and green and blue and violet. And then if we slow it down enough, then we can no longer see it again. So that's, a very, very particular part of the universe that we're able to see. Most of it we actually can't see, which is probably for the best, right? That we can't see radio waves and television waves constantly interfering with what we see on a day-to-day basis. We wouldn't be able to drive because there would be so much stuff in our visual field. So keep in mind that when we talk about vision, when we talk about light, we're really talking about this very narrow strip of reality. So, why do we have so many chapters about vision? Like I mentioned just a minute ago, we are going to be talking about about the eye from here until Chapter 8. So why do we have so many chapters about vision? It's because we are basically visual creatures. What does that mean? Basically means that we interact with the environment mostly through a visual medium. Not every animal does this, right? Can you think of an animal that doesn't rely as much on sight? Bats, for example. Bats are not blind, but they do a lot of echolocation, so they do a lot of hearing-based stuff. What about dogs? Dogs have poor eyesight, so they rely more on hearing and on smell. So we, humans, are visual creatures, which basically just is our way of saying that we rely on vision to do a lot of our day-to-day things. We use vision to navigate, to get from here to the parking lot. We use it for food selection, so to determine whether or not a food is good to eat, or if it's going to be tasty or if it's going to be rotten. We use it for mate selection, so looking at what a potential mate looks like. We use it for safety, knowing not to bump into things, not to fall off a cliff. We do it for reading and for communication. What you're doing right now whenever you're reading this information, that's visual for the most part. And most of the things that we do is visual. With that being said, one of the kind of interesting things about this is that if you have any problem with your ability to see, usually you need glasses right away, right? If you have problems with hearing, for example, I know lots of people who are like deaf in one ear or have hearing impairments, but they don't opt to go get hearing aids immediately like people would with eyeglasses. Why is that? Because a lot of what we do is visual in nature. But we'll talk more about that, especially when we start talking about cochlear implants and all that other good stuff in the hearing chapters. Let's get into the structure of the eye. So we rely very much on these organs. Let's get to know them a little bit. If they're so important to us, maybe we can figure out a little bit more. So introduce yourself. This is the eye. This is the anatomy of the eye, the way you can imagine seeing this is maybe kind of self-explanatory. This is the front of the eye, so the part of the eye that you can see. This is right up here, and then the back of the eye that you can't see, the white being the whites of your eyes, etc. Whenever we see something, in this case this is an R, a letter, this light that is shining or that is emitted from this letter is going to pass through our eye to hit the back of the eye. So everything that we are going to be perceiving is not actually from the front of our eyes, even though that's kind of how it feels, right? It kind of feels like we're seeing with the front of our eyes. But instead, we're actually seeing things with maybe 2 inches back from the front of your eye, because you're going to be seeing it actually with the back of your eye. This is where there are going to be cells that help transduce the light into something that our brain can understand. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk basically from right here, from the front of the eye to the back of the eye. The rest of this video is going to be getting us to this back layer. So here we go. And also for the exam, I may not ask you to label these things, but it will be good to know what each of these individual things do and what they're for. I think they're all bolded in the textbook, but just to let you know that these things are important because they all have their own specific kind of function that helps us see. So let's start with this spot right here, the cornea. And the cornea is is the transparent window of the eye. So it's kind of like a film that goes over the front of your eye and is completely clear in that it has no blood vessels. So it is very sensitive because it doesn't have any blood vessels in it, but it doesn't have any blood vessels in it so that it can be transparent, so that light can easily pass through it to get to the rest of our body. So this, very importantly, is not the white part of our eye. The white part of our eye is called the sclera, and the sclera is different. The cornea is just the part of it that you put your contacts on. That is the cornea. So you've probably heard of people like scratching their corneas and things like that, and that very painful, but can damage your eyesight. Because you're damaging that transparent window for one of your eyes. So we have light that's coming down and that's passing in through. So the first thing that we're going to reach is going to be the aqueous humor after it passes through this window. The aqueous humor is no laughing matter. So it's not humorous, but instead what it is basically a pocket that is filled with a fluid that is going to supply nutrients to the cornea. The cornea is transparent, it doesn't have blood vessels, and that is a weakness, but the aqueous humor is going to provide a lot of those nutrients to make sure that the cornea stays healthy. So that fluid is there to basically help hydrate, not hydrate the eye, but to oxygenate the eye, since it doesn't have blood to do that, and it's also going to help remove some of the waste that accumulates here. Now, moving further down, we're going to get to this spot right here called the iris. And so this spot right here, the iris is actually a muscle. So you know the part of your eye that is colored, so maybe it's brown, maybe it's blue, maybe it's green or hazel or whatever, that is the iris. And so even though it looks pretty, it's actually a muscle. And that muscle is going to expand, and it's going to contract, and it's basically going to control and manipulate how much light is going to get into your eye at any given time. So this is a little bit counterintuitive, right? Because normally when we think about the eye, usually you'll hear people talk about their pupils dilating or constricting. Yeah, the pupil does that. However, what's actually controlling the size of the pupil is the iris. So the iris is going to dilate or it's going to constrict depending on how much light is surrounding us. So hold on to that thought. We've been talking a lot about the pupil. Let's go ahead and talk about the pupil before we unpack what it means for the surrounding light sources to change depending on where we are. The pupil, sorry, is not an interested student. That is a pun that I left in here. Yeah, I knew it wasn't going to work, but so a pupil is an interested student. That is one definition of it. But the definition that we're going to be using in this class is not that. Even though you are pupils who have pupils, the pupil is going to be the hole in your eye. It's going to be a gap in your eye. And so this is why I said this is a common misconception, because a lot of people like to think of the pupil as a structure. It's not actually a structure. It's a hole. It's just a window. It is an aperture. It is just a spot that light is able to escape into. So light is going to enter in through this hole. And the size of this hole is changed by the iris, that spot of the ring in your eye that is colored. That is going to control how big that pupil is. So whenever there is not very much light, whenever we have very low lighting, that pupil is going to get bigger. It's going to get bigger because it basically is your body letting you let in more light. We need all the light that we can get to perceive the rest of the world, the rest of the environment, and so we're going to stretch out that pupil so that as much light as we can get in. But as you've probably noticed before, whenever it's really, really bright, what happens? Basically, your pupils constrict, they get really tiny, they get really small. And what that does is it lets in less light. It's super bright outside, you don't need as much light. And so you're going to shrink those pupils to let less of that in. So you can think of the pupil as doing this, but really you should think about it as the iris doing it, because the iris is what is controlling the size of that pupil. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about the lens. And the lens is going to be the last thing that we talk about before we get to the retina and the fovea. The lens is this spot right here, and it is basically, I always want to say that it's glass because it refracts light very much the same way that light does, but it's not actually glass. You don't have glass in your eye. But you know how whenever you have a contact lens, basically contacts can change the sharpness of the visual world around you because they refract light. That's what these lenses do. And so I always think about it like a magnifying glass. Think about you take a magnifying glass and you hold it, you can hold it anywhere, like if you're looking at something, and everything will be blurry, kind of, but you can probably move it back and forth until it adjusts just right, and then things do look magnified, right? But if you put it too close, it becomes blurry, and if you move it far away, it becomes blurry, right? The lens is basically the magnifying glass for us. The lens is going to help refract light just right. And because it needs to be just right, that means that tiny little things can make it blurry, which is why we need glasses, which is why we need contacts, which is why we need LASIK surgery. So the lens is going to be controlled by the ciliary muscles, which are not labeled on this, but you can see them right here on either side of the lens. And these ciliary muscles are going to change the shape of the lens oh so slightly. So this is part of the reason why, let's say that you are looking right at your computer screen or whatever you're watching this on, but you can also look past the computer screen, right? You can look past it if you kind of blur your eyes a little bit. And so what happens there when you're doing that is you're changing the shape of that lens. You're changing the shape so that you're either seeing farther away or closer to you. That is changed by the ciliary muscles, which are either pushing that lens to get a little bit fatter or pulling it to be a little bit thinner. And so that's a process called accommodation. Accommodation is a word you're going to see a lot this semester. It means a lot of different things. In this case, what we're talking about with accommodation is changing the shape of the lens to adjust how close or how far we are focusing. This is part of the reason why sometimes if somebody's talking to you and they're really, really boring, you just kind of look past them, right? And so they look blurry. It's because of the lens, because the ciliary muscles are not focused, or they're not pushing the lens to focus in on that individual. So accommodation is going to change that refractive power. So let's focus just a little bit on the lens for a second, because I want to touch base to talk about glasses and contacts, because a lot of us have problems with eyesight. Usually most people in a classroom seem to have some kind of corrective eyewear. Maybe it's contacts or maybe it's glasses. And sometimes this is something that you're mostly kind of born with, but it can also be something that develops with time. For example, my dad didn't need glasses until he was like 33 or something like that, and then he needed glasses. And so problems with eyesight is something that is very, very common, and there's lots of different variations of this. We'll talk more about blindness and being non-sighted later in the semester. For now, we're mostly going to be focusing on problems with the lens. And so this is the most common kind of eyesight problem that we have, where we're either refracting that light too early or too late for it to really appear focused. And so like I was saying, just like with the magnifying glass, how you can move it forward and backwards, and if you move it too close, everything's blurry. If you move it too far back, everything is blurry. The same thing happens with our lens. If our lens is slightly misshapen, or if our eye is slightly misshapen, which puts our lens in a different place, then we have everything can appear blurry for the same reason that it does with a magnifying glass. So the two main kinds of eyesight problems in this regard are myopia and hyperopia. Myopia is also called nearsightedness, and it's basically whenever you have the light that is going to refract. So in other words, it's going to focus right in front of the retina. It's going to focus too early, in other words. Which is why whenever something is far away from you, it appears more blurry than if something is closer up to you, because if it's close up to you, it's close enough so that whenever it refracts too early, it's okay. It's not that big a deal. Hyperopia, on the other hand, farsightedness, means that you can see things well from far away, but things that are really close are really blurry to you. And this is whenever light is refracting too late, in other words. So it refracts behind the retina. And everything gets kind of blurry. It's hard to read things in front of you because basically what you're reading is refracting too far behind your retina. So those are the two most common kinds, and they need and so usually contacts or glasses can fix this temporarily. But also another common flavor of this is astigmatism, and astigmatism is different because it's not necessarily that the light is refracting too early or too late. Instead, the cornea, so that window, or the lens is misshapen. And whenever that happens, because it's not curved correctly, that light is going to enter into your eye unevenly, and therefore the entire image that you're seeing can be kind of misshapen. So imagine a magnifying glass. If it was a little bit too thick in one area and a little bit too thin in one area, then you'd be able to focus on half of it at a time, but the other half wouldn't look right? And so sometimes the visual field can appear very bumpy or exaggerated on one side because of this. And so astigmatism is complicated. It's much harder. So those of you who have astigmatism, you know that it's much more expensive to have glasses for astigmatism or contacts for astigmatism, because you have to get them custom made, essentially, because you have to be very specific. Whereas with hyperopia and myopia, basically you can get a simple prescription that allows you to correct that vision. So a very quick look at both nearsightedness and farsightedness. So here with myopia, what we're looking at is light is coming in, it's hitting that lens, and you can kind of see it's converging all right here before it hits the back of the eye. And the opposite is true for hyperopia, where it's hitting the back of the eye. What we want is something like this. With emmetropia, which is just normal vision, non-corrected vision, you see that it focuses right here on the back of the eye, which is awesome, and this is why glasses can help us fix this problem. So in this case, you have somebody with myopia, where normally it would focus too early, and you're seeing here where the light is coming in, and this glass is going to refract it to basically enlarge it very slightly before it hits the lens, which now can focus it on the right spot. Astigmatism is a little more complicated. If you have astigmatism, that means that your lens or your cornea is not shaped uniformly. There are some spots that are thicker than others. And so if you're looking right down here in the middle and not all of these lines appear to be straight, then that can be a problem with astigmatism. And so that's a whole nother can of worms. Alright, that's where we're going to end this video. I'm going to pick up by talking about our friend, the retina, in the next video. Bye.